Hello, my young scholar friends. This is kind of a brief gloss on a couple hundred years of Irish history to help you understand like what the heck is going on in James Joyce's novel. This PowerPoint is optional. You're not going to be quizzed over or tested on it. It's kind of a loose PowerPoint story time take on Irish history. It's just designed to help you out, to give you some context for what's going on in these periods. We're going to go through it pretty briskly. If you don't understand all of it, if you can't remember all of it, that's fine. But this will help you understand what some of the characters in this novel are arguing about. Why are we doing this? Gain a better understanding of the political situation during James Joyce's life, understand the relationship between English and Irish culture. They're very different things. If you ever encounter those people, you need to understand that they're very different things, and to help build a vocabulary for what's going on during this time period. Cool. So, here we see Ireland and the United Kingdom as they are today. Ireland is the smaller island on the left. The Republic of Ireland, the current government of Ireland, is there in green. Everything else, except for that little bit of France down in the corner, is the United Kingdom. It's called the United Kingdom because it's composed of England, plus Wales, plus Scotland, plus what's called Northern Ireland, or sometimes Ulster. There's a little bit of the island of Ireland that still to this day is under British control. That little bit down there where you see like Penzance and Exeter, that's what used to be Cornwall, but Cornwall hasn't existed for a very long time. And then like on the other side of the channel, France is France. They do French things, baguette, etc. Basic terminology. Irish can mean a person from the Republic of Ireland, the current country in the present day, or a person who lived there when it was occupied by the British, or a person who's descended from those, like we have a lot of Irish Americans in America. English, obviously, somebody from England, which is the southern part of that island. It's part of Great Britain. They're descended from the Anglo-Saxons. Great Britain, England, plus Scotland, plus Wales, plus Northern Ireland. That's important. Somebody from Scotland, they're British, but they're not English. The same way somebody from Massachusetts is American, but they're not Texan. Northern Ireland are the 6 counties in the north of Ireland that are still part of the United Kingdom to this day. We'll talk about why. Ulster is the traditional name for that northern chunk. Most of that land today is part of Northern Ireland. The terms are often used interchangeably. Anglo-Irish is the ruling class of British-occupied Ireland. English, sometimes Scottish Protestants who were settled in Ireland. We'll talk about them more later on. And then if you see the word Celt, like James Joyce talked about Celtic things a lot in that one essay, that's the ethnic group that includes the Irish, Scottish, Welsh, a couple of others. Those are the people who lived in the islands before the Anglo-Saxons showed up and became the English. You look on the left, you see the traditional provinces that Ireland has been divided into. If you look on the right, you see the current political distribution. The Republic of Ireland, and then Northern Ireland, which includes most of what was known as Ulster. Early modern Irish history, from like 1500 to the 20th century, is largely driven by responses to the English. During the Tudor period, when you've got all the different Henrys and Queen Elizabeth hanging out, Ireland is brought more or less under the complete control of the English. Prior to that, there was off and on English, and sometimes even like going back to the 1100s, 1200s, like Norman involvement in Ireland. But the island was mostly self-governing. The English weren't like super in control. This changes starting in the 1500s. Henry VIII, the dude who made the Anglican religion exist because he wanted to get an annulment but wasn't able to get one from the Pope. decides that he wants to like clamp down control on Ireland. He gets himself declared King of Ireland in 1542. Over the next 60 years, the English reign in, subdue, take control, sometimes through war, sometimes through diplomacy, the whole of the Ireland. By the time of James I, around 1600, he came after Queen Elizabeth, that's when Shakespeare is alive, Ireland is entirely under English control. Before all that stuff, 1200 to 1500, there's limited English settlement in Ireland, mostly in an area called the Pale. That's where Dublin is today. It's where the English government had strong control. You can see it over on the right-hand side of this map of Ireland around 1500. Outside of that, you'll notice it's broken up into all these tiny little chunks. Those are all local Irish, or sometimes Irish combined with Norman, like barons, dukes, things like that. They mostly run the country pretty independently. They're speaking a different language, Irish Gaelic. They have different laws, different customs. They lead a very, like, in some areas, nomadic tribal life. They're a different religion. Ireland is Catholic rather than Protestant. If you ever hear somebody use the phrase beyond the pale, like if somebody says something really inappropriate during a class, you might say, whoa, that was beyond the pale. Like that was outrageous, that was crazy, that was weird, that was inappropriate. This comes from this period. The area settled by the English was known as the Pale, and everything outside of it, where the Irish were, the English considered to be barbaric, alien, terrible, monstrous, no good, bad. So when you hear somebody say beyond the pale, they're referencing Irish-English feuds from the 1500s. So, after about 1600, the English, through some wars, through some treaties, through a variety of things, have more or less political control over the whole island. They decide they want to make sure that it can stay under their control long term. They want to make sure that they control this society all the way down. This is tricky because Ireland has a different culture, a different language, as well as a different religion. Ireland is Catholic. The English are Anglican Protestants. Their solution is a plantation system. The English seize control of all the good farmland in the country, the parts that are good for growing things, and give it, often for free or very reduced price, to colonizers and settlers from England and Scotland. They bring their own people over, give them the best land, set them up as a new ruling class. They make up new noble titles for them so that there's a solid class of Anglo-Irish Protestants who can keep the country in line. This is also when you start to see the decline of the Irish Gaelic language. Education is done in English. The language is, the original Irish language is discouraged, sometimes banned. You see here some maps of the plantation process, color-coded according to different waves throughout the 1500s and 1600s. The north of Ireland is where the best land for like farming is. The most productive land, the most fertile land, the land you can do stuff with, you can make a lot of food, you can grow cash crops. That's what they took and gave to these English and Scottish settlers for their plantations. If you go down south, the land is not quite as good. If you go out west, it's really difficult, rocky terrain. You can see here patterns by which, over the course of several decades, the English bring in their own people and give them all of the top-tier land in the north of the country. Notice that this mimics like the map we saw of Ireland earlier, right? The areas where the most English and Scottish came over are the areas that are still part of the United Kingdom today. The plantation has major world historical impacts. This sounds like ridiculous. A lot of y'all are not going to believe me that this stuff from the late 1500s and 1600s is massively important, but it is. It was majorly influencing politics within my lifetime in Ireland and England. The process is heavier in the north. It's where the better farms are, so you get more Anglo-Irish, more Protestants in that region than in the south or the west. This is why eventually when Ireland gains independence, the United Kingdom doesn't let that northern portion go. This will lead to all kinds of terrible conflicts throughout the 20th century. There was still like major strife borderline civil war stuff, terrorism on both sides in Ireland and Northern Ireland well into like my young life. Like it's not until the late 90s, the Good Friday Agreement, which Bill Clinton helped negotiate, that these problems between these two different groups get like mostly settled, although they still flare up every now and then. Religion is a major factor in these issues, but it's not the only one. As time goes on, the conflicts between Northern Ireland and the rest of Ireland, they stop fighting about like Catholic versus Protestant, even though that's mostly how the teams work out, and it's mostly just like our guys versus their guys. It's like a political fight over control as much as it is a religious fight, especially once you get into the 20th century. The rule of that Anglo-Irish class, the people who took power, the people who were given the good farmlands, the fancy titles, is called the Protestant ascendancy, or sometimes just the ascendancy. They created legislature, statutes, laws that were collectively called the penal laws during the 1600s and 1700s to restrict the political and social power of Catholics. They wanted to keep them as this poor, powerless underclass to prevent political fights. This was at its worst during the Cromwellian period, Oliver Cromwell, mid-1600s. During his occupation of Ireland, all Catholic priests are exiled from the country under pain of death. Priests who remained in Ireland were subject to execution on the spot. This led to the formation of secret, hidden Catholic services. People out in the country would literally hide renegade refugee priests in their cellar, in an attic, wherever they could, and try to gather in small houses secretly for religious ceremonies. Here we see a painting of such a service. This is a priest saying mass in like a tiny Irish cottage where he is hiding out. This painting was made during the 1800s, but it depicts a scene from the 1600s. If this man was found out that like he was a priest in Ireland at the time, he likely would have been killed. The laws get less intense over time. By the end of the 1600s, priests are allowed back within certain capacities, although they're very restricted. But there are still huge restrictions on Catholics in Ireland. Between 1600 and the early 1800s, they were at varying times, by law, not allowed to do any of these. They could not hold any kind of public office. You can't be a member of parliament if you're Catholic. You can't vote if you're Catholic. You can't work as a lawyer if you're Catholic. You can't attend Trinity College, which is the only university in Ireland at the time. You also can't leave Ireland for the purpose of attending a different college. It's illegal for you to be like, oh, I'm Catholic, I'm going to go get my university degree in France. You can get arrested if you try and do that. You can't own a horse worth more than £5. You can't own firearms of any kind. You will be executed if you have a gun of any sort. You can't serve in the military. You can't adopt children. If you have a friend who's a Protestant and they like you and they leave you some land, not legal. That land goes to the government instead. You can't teach in any kind of school, public or private, and you're not allowed to build Catholic churches out of materials other than wood. You can't build a church out of like stone, and your churches can't be built within viewing distance of the major roads. Pretty severe, like, repression. Nasty stuff. By the late 1700s, the Irish are understandably very upset about all this, and this is when Theobald Wolfetone, let's just take a moment to reflect on how excellent that name is. Theobald Wolfetone enters the scene. Mr. Wolfetone is actually a member of the Protestant ascendancy himself, but he and a few other members of that upper ruling class are themselves getting a little tired of all this repression. They're like, maybe we shouldn't be like treating these people this way. This is increasingly the case as the Enlightenment rolls on, both in the United Kingdom, Ireland, America, the continent. Everybody's thinking about freedom of religion, freedom of the press, freedom of speech, things like that. The American Revolution has been very successful. The French Revolution has been very successful in its own way. By the 1790s, a lot of people in Ireland are looking at this repressive government that's oppressing them on the basis of their ethnicity and religion, and they're like, hey, That thing where the Americans threw a bunch of tea in the harbor, and that thing where the French cut off like several thousand heads, what if we did that? Theobald Wolfetone, who is himself a Protestant, founds the Society of United Irishmen in 1791 with the aim of securing stronger rights for Irish Catholics and self-governance for Ireland. 1798, Mr. Wolfetone and the United Irishmen attempt a revolution. Like the overwhelming majority of Irish rebellions, it fails miserably, and they basically all get killed. They're trying to free Ireland from English control and create a new republic based on American democracy and the French Republic at the time, Enlightenment values, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, things like that. They want Catholics and Protestants to be able to coexist. The United Kingdom is not okay with this, especially because France sends troops to help. Revolutionary France is like, yes, we also do not like the English. We would love it if you founded a revolutionary republic against them. Let's send some armies over to help you out. Unfortunately, the weather prevents any of those armies from being able to get heavily involved. There's constant storms during the time that the rebellion is going on. Many ships are wrecked. Many of the French soldiers drown. The rest head back home. Theobald Wolfetone said it was the luckiest thing to happen to the English since the Spanish Armada, centuries before, was destroyed in a similar way. The rebellion is crushed. All of its leaders, one way or another, end up dead. This is one of 3 dozen failed Irish rebellions, by the way. I was in Dublin in October, and when you go there, it's just oh, you walk by a wall, and there's a historical mural or something, and it's a failed rebellion. And then you go another block, and there's a historical mural, and it's a different failed rebellion. And there's a lot of them. A lot of failure in Irish political history. The United Irishmen are sometimes in Ireland referred to as Croppy Boys, which is a name I love. These revolutionaries, to show their disdain and hatred for the ruling British class, cropped or cut their hair into very short styles, to contrast with the long, flowing, powdery wigs popular with the English nobility. We see some paintings of Croppy Boys coming into conflict with other people here. One of them is supposed to be the young Croppy Boy in the green jacket is arguing with his Anglo-Irish father. More Croppy Boys, Croppy Boys, Croppy Boys, Croppy Boys. There's a park in Dublin dedicated to the Croppy Boys. All right. The next major stage in Irish history, Daniel O'Connell the Liberator. In the early 1800s, Mr. O'Connell and a few other people bring about an end to the penal laws. Those are the laws restricting Catholic involvement in things. It's a process known as Catholic emancipation. Daniel O'Connell, in the early 1800s, 1820s, 1830s, is when he's most active. He founds a political organization called the Catholic Association and uses large-scale but deliberately non-violent protests to pursue reforms which will help Catholics. What O'Connell does, he's a Catholic, he's not allowed to hold office, but there are lots of Irish people who might be interested in voting for him. He keeps running for Parliament, he keeps having people write his name in for elections, and he keeps winning the elections and deliberately showing up to be hey guys, I'd like to take my seat in the legislature now, and forcing the English government to be no, you're not allowed to do that because you're Catholic. That then gives him the stage for a massive protest. His goal was to unsettle the English enough without actually starting a war, but implying that this could start a war, that they'll cave in to his demands and remove the restrictions on Catholics. Increasingly, people are yes, we want Catholic freedom, and also maybe Ireland should be given more control over its own affairs within the British Empire. The British response: Duke of Wellington, Napoleonic war hero, at this time Prime Minister, if we cannot get rid of the Catholic Association, we must look to civil war in Ireland sooner or later. O'Connell's own philosophy: they must crush us or conciliate us. The British government, not wanting to deal with the possibility of another civil war or another revolution, especially given the revolutions in America, France, other places have destroyed monarchies and completely reshaped societies, removes most restrictions on Catholic and political social life in an effort to preempt civil unrest. By about the tail end of the 1830s, the Catholics in Ireland have about the same legal rights as anybody else. Unsurprisingly, this makes O'Connell a major national hero. There are tons of memorials to him in Ireland to this day. The main thoroughfare in Dublin has been named O'Connell Street, and at the very head of it, there's this massive statue of him from the 1800s. But fun fact, if you're ever there in person and you look closely, you can see some bullet holes from the 1916 Easter Rising, which kicked off the Irish War of Independence that they never got around to fixing, even though they're 104 years old now, or whatever. After Catholic emancipation, they're no longer barred from office, but there are still restrictions on who can vote based around money, land ownership. You don't get total equality about who can vote in Ireland until the early 20th century. But those religious restrictions are gone. The leaders of the Catholic Church in Ireland, the bishops and the British government, reach a kind of working truce. The government of Ireland is mostly done by appointed British officials who have a little castle in the middle of Dublin, but a lot of society is effectively controlled by the teachings of the Catholic Church. This brings us to the famine, 1845 to 49. You've probably heard of the Great Potato Famine, the Great Irish Famine, the Great Potato Blight, things like that. Ireland is a very poor country at this time. It's heavily dependent on potatoes for sustenance. A disease just absolutely murders all the potatoes, basically. It's a blight. It causes the potatoes to rot. You can't grow them. You can't keep them. They're useless. This leads to massive starvation. About 1 million Irish people starve to death, and another million flee the country to avoid starving to death. Most of those people came to America. The total population decline during this period is about 25%. Ireland's population today is still lower in absolute terms than it was before the famine. Ireland is one of only a tiny number of places to have a population today that's lower than it was in the 1800s. The working classes of Ireland are completely unable to afford food. Riots, looting, civil unrest become common. Oftentimes, when traveling through the countryside, you would find dead, starved, malnourished bodies along the roadside with green foam crusted around their mouths. In rural areas, people often grew so desperate that they tried to eat grass as a last resort. The potato was a staple for the Irish because it's extremely cheap. It gives you a lot of calories, and you can grow it anywhere. You don't have to have good farmland. You don't have to plow a field. You don't have to have farm equipment. You can literally grow them in the dirt floor of your tiny little cottage. Very easy to do, very helpful. They were very dependent upon that crop, and when it was wiped out, it had catastrophic effects for the whole society. However, not everybody is affected equally by the famine. There's still plenty of food being grown in Ireland. There's still plenty of wheat. There's plenty of beef. But it's mostly being grown for export back to England. The working classes can't afford to buy bread. They can't afford to buy the wheat that their own country is growing. Very few Irish people owned their own land at this time. It was held by Anglo-Irish landlords, that upper class, that ruling class who came over with the plantations. They continued to use their farms to grow cash crops and food for export during this time. Additionally, the British government generally refused to provide government relief or get involved in this in any way, really, because of a preference for free market economics. They didn't want to get involved as a government. They thought that was bad for the economy. You should just let the invisible hand of the free market solve this problem. English poet Ebenezer Jones wrote about it at the time. In the year AD 1846, there were exported from Ireland 3 million quarters of wheat, barley, and oats, besides, not counting flour, beans, peas, and rye, 180,000 cattle, 6,000 calves, more than 250,000 sheep, over 180,000 swine, food that is in the shape of meat and bread for about one half of the Irish population. And yet this very year of AD 1846 was preeminently, owing to a land monopoly, the famine year for the Irish people. People are starving left and right, but most of the food being made in the country is being sent back to England for consumption or profit of those people. The British response to the famine was largely one of indifference. Although there was some charity work both in the UK and abroad, there wasn't much in the way of organized government response. Queen Victoria donates £2,000. That amount is matched by the Tsar and the Pope. The Ottoman Sultan actually offers to send £10,000 of supplies and relief. Pounds here meaning the British currency, not like weight. But diplomats persuaded him not to do that and to only send £1,000 worth instead, because they worried it would look weird or bad if the Ottoman ruler donated more than the British Queen did. Ultimate effects of the famine. Population plummets, tons of people leave the country permanently, and people are understandably frustrated with the British Empire, the Anglo-Irish ruling class, and landlords in particular. The late 1800s, the question of Ireland, will it be independent or not, becomes a major breaking point for the British Empire. There's greater and greater, increasingly furious demand amongst the Irish to be allowed to govern themselves, to have independence. This spills out into actual political violence. In the late 1800s, there's what's known as the Phoenix Park killings. Some important British politicians get assassinated in what's the equivalent of like Central Park in Dublin. This is further complicated by the fact that most of the Irish can now vote. Not all of them. There are still some like property/income restrictions. And the Irish definitely, like, there aren't enough of them. They're not a big enough population to win the election outright. But they are a large enough voting bloc to be able to throw an election in favor of either of the two major British parties during portions of the late 1800s. We see here some political cartoons showing this dangerous, monstrous, grotesque Irish figure called the Irish Frankenstein, implying that various politicians trying to, advocate for the cause of Ireland have made a violent monster who runs around stabbing people. Notice like the very like distorted, nasty features. At the time, the British thought that the Irish were kind of like a lesser race. They didn't think they counted as fully white. They thought they were a barbaric people. So you often see like very deliberately monstrous features in English portrayals of the Irish in visual media. Here we see the Irish vampire. It's labeled National League. That face, you'll get to know it a little bit more in just a bit. We see this evil thing about to suck the blood from a young, innocent English woman. This brings us to Charles Stewart Parnell. He leads the Irish Parliamentary Party in the 1880s and a chunk of the 1890s. He first became a politician by fighting to improve the lives of the Irish working class and farmers. During the 1870s, he advocated very hard for things that would benefit them, things that would ensure that we don't end up in situations where there's a massive famine, but nobody is allowed to eat the food. He advocates for what's known as home rule, the idea that the Irish should be allowed self-governance. For a brief period, he was one of the most controversial and most powerful men in the United Kingdom. How he tells the Irish to vote can at times swing an election between the Tories and the Whigs, which are the two major political parties in England. Here you see a map. This is the 1885 parliamentary elections. Notice things are split. You can identify some trends. All of Ireland, except for that one little bit up in the very north, is green. They're voting for the Irish Parliamentary Party. That's Parnell's party. They are potentially enough of a vote to prevent either of the parties from getting a majority without their help. However, Parnell's career, and with it the Irish hopes for home rule, are completely undone. On the right, you'll see a woman named Catherine O'Shea. She was married to a man named, I believe, William O'Shea. Parnell had a very, very, very long and very involved affair with Catherine O'Shea. When this news came out, people were scandalized. Parnell was considered immoral, evil, inappropriate behavior. People denounced him and they denounced Catherine O'Shea. They called her Kitty O'Shea. They were like, oh, Parnell is supposed to be leading us, but really he's having an affair. He's off making out with Kitty O'Shea in a corner or something when he should be leading the Irish people to freedom. Importantly, the leaders of the Catholic Church in Ireland denounce Parnell as immoral and unfit. He loses basically all of his political influence and dies shortly thereafter. Some of the people who were very seriously dedicated to the idea of a free Irish nation view the church's behavior as a betrayal. They think, wow, the bishops are priests. They wanted to be rid of Parnell because they were worried that he was going to lead us into a new free nation in which they would have less power. They thought that the bishops had sold them out, that they had sided with the English to get rid of Parnell. And so this is the first time in Irish history that there's a major tension between Irish nationalism, the cause for Ireland to be independent and free, and Irish Catholicism, the religious leaders. Parnell's reputation, many of his long-term fans and supporters thought of him as the uncrowned king of Ireland, the man who had the plan, the man who knew what to do, the man who should have brought them into liberty and freedom, but who was unjustly betrayed. In contrast, many highly religious members of Irish society despised him. We see this play out in chapter 1 of Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. It's what Stephen's family is fighting about when they're having that dinner together. James Joyce himself, as a young man, was very, very fond of Parnell. Parnell was one of his heroes. Also, I'm going to give you like a whole nother PowerPoint on Parnell and that dinner scene. What does any of this have to do with James Joyce? James Joyce was born in the 1880s. He would have grown up seeing all these tensions play out. In particular, the relationship between Irishness and Catholicness plays a major role in his work. You may be wondering now, okay, so they've got like 1 million failed rebellions or whatever. Does Ireland ever get freedom? Yes, a process that starts with the Easter Rising, an armed rebellion against the British in 1916. That's about 2 years after the final events of Portrait. The Easter Rising itself fails, like most Irish rebellions. It's quickly put down. The British end up like shelling large sections of Dublin. They execute all of the leaders, but it like galvanizes people to the cause. And by the early 1920s, Ireland will have successfully won a war of independence from the United Kingdom, except for those 6 counties up north, which are still part of the United Kingdom to this day, and were a major sticking point throughout the 20th century. Also, those magnets in my classroom. Yeah, remember when we had like a classroom up on the board at the front? Those are dudes from the Easter Rising. I bought the magnets as souvenirs back when I was in Dublin in October. Roger Casement, James Connolly. They were good dudes, interesting dudes. I have way more resources on this Irish history stuff, so if you're curious, just let me know. I'll hook you up with extra stuff you can study if you want to learn more about it. Thank you. I hope our half hour of Irish history story time was helpful. Have a nice day, y'all.